Welcome to the Hidden Cipher, where we decode the greatest mysteries of mankind. Relax, lean back, and let our voices lull you to sleep after discovering the wonders. Tonight, we will embark on a journey together to find one of history's greatest mysteries, the legendary city of Atlantis. More than 2.400 years ago, the great philosopher Plato described a glorious civilization, a mighty empire with technology far beyond its time. And then one fateful night, it all disappeared to the bottom of the ocean within 24 hours. Since then, the question has haunted scientists, archaeologists and mystery enthusiasts around the world. Did Atlantis really exist? Or was it just a fable created by Plato? Over the course of the story, we'll delve into each clue. We'll start with Plato's ancient writings in the Timaeus and Critias, where he details city structures with concentric circles, golden palaces, and advanced irrigation systems. Then we'll explore bold hypotheses from modern scientists, from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, from the Greek island of Santorini to the mysterious Antarctic, and even recent discoveries at the bottom of the Caribbean. Each location holds intriguing evidence, strange coincidences that will leave us amazed. We'll hear from archaeologists who have spent their lives hunting for traces of Atlantis. Analyze groundbreaking archaeological findings from modern sonar technology, and compare them to natural disasters throughout history, from the catastrophic eruption of Mount Thera in 1600 BC to devastating earthquakes that wiped out entire civilizations. But it doesn't stop there. We delve into profound philosophical questions. Why has the story of Atlantis haunted humanity for millennia? Is it a collective memory of a real disaster? Or is it a subconscious fear of the collapse of civilization? And most importantly, if Atlantis really existed, how would finding it completely change what we know about human history? This is not just a story about the past, but also a warning for the present. In an age when climate change threatens coastal cities, the story of a civilization swallowed by the ocean has perhaps never been more relevant. So, subscribe to the Hidden Cipher so you don't miss any of the mysteries we unravel. Turn off the lights, close your eyes, and let us take you to the legendary Lost City of Gold, where the line between myth and truth is incredibly thin. Our journey begins here, from the ancient inscriptions in the Library of Athens, where it all began with a story passed from mouth to mouth, from generation to generation, until Plato, one of the greatest minds of all time, decided to write it down. Atlantis awaits. The answer lies somewhere beneath the waves of time. And tonight, together we will seek the truth. Imagine a summer afternoon in Athens. Around 360 BC, soft sunlight filters through the ancient olive trees in the grounds of the Academy, where an old man sits writing. It is Plato, now nearly 70, with a silver beard and still sharp eyes. His sinewy fingers grip a pen, carving each letter into a waxed wooden tablet. He is writing a story he insists is true, however strange it may sound. Plato was no idle legend teller. He founded the Academy of Athens around 387 BC, where his students studied mathematics, philosophy, astronomy, and natural science. Among his students was Aristotle, who would become one of the greatest philosophers of all time. Plato came from an aristocratic Athenian family, studied under the legendary Socrates, and spent his life searching for truth. So why would such a man write about a lost city, a vanished civilization? The answer lies in the origin of this story. Plato did not invent Atlantis. He heard it through a long oral tradition that spanned many generations. And the final source? An old Egyptian priest in the city of Say, nearly 250 years earlier. To understand the story of Atlantis, we must go back to around 590 BC, to one of Athens' greatest legislators, Solon. This man was not only a brilliant politician, but also a poet and philosopher. Solon drafted important reforms for Athens, freed debt slaves, and laid the foundations for later Athenian democracy. But after completing his legislative work, Solon did something unusual. He left Athens for 10 years. Why? Plutarch, a Greek historian who lived in the 1st century AD, explains that Solon wanted to avoid the pressure from the Athenians, who constantly asked him to explain and revise the new laws. Instead of getting caught up in political controversy, Solon decided to travel to learn from other civilizations. And his most important destination? Egypt, the most ancient land known to the Greeks. When Solon arrived in Egypt, the country was in the 26th dynasty, a period known as the Sate dynasty. Because the capital had been moved to the city of Say in the Nile Delta. Say was no ordinary city. It was a religious center dedicated to the goddess Neith in Egyptian mythology. The goddess of creation, wisdom, war and weaving, the Greeks identified her with Athena, the patron goddess of Athens. Interestingly, Herodotus, the father of history, also confirmed this trip. He wrote in his work that Solon met with Pharaoh Amasis in Egypt. So, this is not a completely fictional story. Solon really did go to Egypt, and he really did talk to the learned priests there. Imagine the scene. One day, at the temple of Neith in Say, Solon, a Greek proud of his people's history, sat down with the Egyptian priests. He began to tell them the most ancient events of Greece, about Pharaoh, who was called the first man, about Niobe, about the great flood of Deucalion and Pyrrha. And it was here that an old priest, whom Plutarch later named Sonches of Say, said something that stunned Solon. "O Solon! Solon, you Greeks are forever children. There is not a single old Greek." This statement may sound offensive, but its meaning is much deeper. The priest continued to explain, "You are young in spirit, because you have no faith from ancient traditions, no knowledge that truly fades with time." And then the old Egyptian began to expound a startling theory, a theory of periodic catastrophes that wipe out human civilization. "There have been and will be many destructions of mankind," he said, "from various causes. The greatest destructions were by fire and water, and the lesser ones by countless other causes." This is the first twist in our story. The Egyptian priest is describing a view of history that is completely different from what the Greeks believed. While the Greeks remembered only one great flood, the Egyptians insisted that there had been many such disasters, catastrophes that wiped out most of humanity's knowledge and memory, leaving only fragments passed down through myth. And that is why the Greeks were childish. Every time a disaster struck, the survivors in the remote mountains had to start all over again. They had no writing, no books, no records. Their knowledge regressed to primitive times. And as civilization slowly recovered, the vague memories of the great past turned into myths, turned into legends. But Egypt was different. The priest explained that because of its unique geography, protected by the desert and fed by the Nile, which floods regularly, Egypt was less vulnerable to these disasters. Egyptian priests had meticulously recorded history for millennia. They were the gatekeepers of human memory. And then the old priest began to tell Solon a story that even the Athenians had forgotten. "Listen, Solon," he said, "both for yourself and for your city, and above all for the goddess, who is the common patron, parent, and teacher of both our cities. She founded your city 1,000 years before ours. Having received the seed of your race from Earth and Hephaestus, our city was founded afterward, and according to our sacred records is 8,000 years old." Let's stop here for a moment. The priest is saying that Athens was founded 9,000 years before Solon. That would be about 9,600 BC. That's 11,600 years from today. This is a terribly controversial number, and we'll explore it more later. But now let the priest continue. He said that ancient Athens, the Athens of 9,000 years ago, not the Athens that Solon knew, was an extraordinary nation. It had excellent laws, the bravest warriors, and was the leader of the entire Greek world. This ancient Athens had performed a historic feat. It had saved the entire Mediterranean from enslavement. Enslaved by whom? A mighty empire came from the west, from beyond the Pillar of Heracles, that is, the Strait of Gibraltar today. The name of that empire was Atlantis. And this, my dear friends, is a historic moment. This is the first time in classical literature that the name, Atlantis, is mentioned. Not in a mythical poem, not in a fairy tale, but in a historical dialogue, narrated by a learned Egyptian priest, heard by a respected Athenian lawgiver, and recorded by one of the greatest philosophers of all time. The priest described Atlantis thus: "In this island of Atlantis, there was a great and marvelous empire, which dominated the whole island and many other islands. together with parts of the continent. Moreover, in the land within the Pillar of Heracles, they conquered Libya as far as Egypt, and Europe as far as Tyrrhenia, that is, the Tuscany region of Italy today. Understand the scale. Atlantis was more than just a single island. It was an empire, a confederation of kingdoms that stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea. They controlled vast swaths of North Africa and Europe. It was a superpower, the likes of which the ancient world had never seen. And then, this power decided to expand even further. They gathered a huge army and attacked Europe and Egypt at the same time. It was a massive invasion, an attempt to enslave the entire Mediterranean world under a single banner. Who could stand against such a force? According to the Egyptian priest, there was only one nation, Athens. Ancient Athens, the Athens of 9,000 years ago, stood up. Initially, they led a coalition of Greek states against the invaders. But as their allies surrendered or fled, Athens stood alone to face the full might of the Atlantis Empire. The battle must have been incredibly fierce. The priest said that Athens experienced the most extreme dangers. But in the end, through their superior courage and military skill, Athens was victorious. They defeated the invaders, saved those who had not yet been enslaved, and generously freed all others living in the area of Heracles' pillar. This should have been the greatest moment in the history of Athens. A victory to be remembered forever. But it wasn't. Something terrible happened next. And here's the biggest twist in the story. But then, there were great earthquakes and floods. And in one unfortunate day and night, all your warriors sank into the earth at once. And the island of Atlantis also disappeared into the depths of the sea in the same way. Read this sentence carefully. The priest is not just saying that Atlantis disappeared. He is saying that ancient Athens, the victors, was also destroyed at the same time. In one day and one night, both of the greatest civilizations of the ancient world were wiped off the map. The catastrophe must have been global in scope. The earthquakes and floods affected more than just one region. They must have triggered tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, and catastrophic tectonic upheavals across the Mediterranean and Atlantic. The priest ends the story with a gruesome detail. For that reason the sea in those parts is impassable and impenetrable. Because there is a mudbank in the way, and this is caused by the subsidence of the island. This isn't just a myth about a swallowed city. This is a specific geographical account. A large island sank, leaving behind dangerous shoals and muddy seas that made the sea impassable. The ancient Greeks actually believed that there were such seas beyond the Pillars of Hercules, seas so dangerous that ships could not pass through them. Solon must have been stunned when he heard the story. This was not just a story about a lost civilization. This was the story of Athens itself, of an Athens greater and more ancient than any Greek could have imagined. An Athens that had once saved the world but had been forgotten by history. According to Plato, Solon was so fascinated by the story that he asked the Egyptian priests for more details. And they agreed. Solon wrote down everything, the geographical details, the political structure, the customs, even the names of the kings of Atlantis. Solon took these notes back to Athens with the intention of turning them into a great epic poem. He wanted to tell this story to his fellow citizens, to remind them of a glorious past that had been forgotten. But his busy political life and old age prevented him. Solon never completed the poem. However, he told this story to his family. He told it to his close friend, Dropides, the grandfather of old Critias. And Dropides told it to his son, old Critias, who then told it to his grandson, young Critias. Here is an important detail to note. Plato does not say that he invented the Atlantis story. He carefully constructed a clear oral tradition. Egyptian priests at say, circa 590 BC. Tell Solon, 590 BC. Solon told Dropides. Dropides told his son old Critias. The elder Critias told his nephew the young Critias, about 450 BC. Critias the younger recounts in his dialogues with Socrates, Timaeus, and Hermocrates. Plato recorded, circa 360 BC. Plato even tells us exactly when young Critias heard this story. It was during the Apatoria, an important Athenian festival for registering children in the gens, families. Critias was 9 years old, and his grandfather, old Critias, was nearly 90. We can calculate. If young Critias lived from 460 to 403 BC, then the Apatoria would have taken place around 451 BC. Why are these details important? Because they show that Plato is trying to establish the authenticity of the story. He doesn't say, "I imagined a city," or, "there is a certain ancient story." He says, "This is a true story, attested to by Solon, one of the 7 sages of Greece, a relative and close friend of my ancestors." And then, around 360 BC, when Plato was nearly 70, he decided to write the story down, not as an epic poem, as Solon had intended, but as a philosophical dialogue, a form he perfected over the course of his life. Plato wrote 2 dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. In Timaeus, the story of Atlantis is told briefly as part of a larger cosmological discussion. In Critias, Plato intended to give a full account of Atlantis, geography, architecture, politics, society, military affairs, and war with Athens. The setting of these 2 dialogues is extremely interesting. The characters include Socrates, Plato's teacher, the great Athenian philosopher, although he died in 399 BC. Before Plato wrote this book. Critias, Athenian politician, related to Plato, and also one of the infamous 30 tyrants of Athens. Timaeus, Locrian philosopher and mathematician, possibly a fictional character based on Pythagoras. Hermocrates, famous Syracuse general. The dialogue takes place in a courtyard in Athens, possibly Critias's home. This is the second day of discussion. The day before, Socrates described his ideal society, i.e. the Republic. Now, Socrates wants to see that ideal society, in action, to see it in action. In history. And Critias replied, "I know a perfect story for that. A story about ancient Athens, an Athens that really existed. An Athens as perfect as the ideal society that Socrates described." But now we have to ask the difficult questions. Was Plato telling the truth? Or was he just creating a philosophical allegory? There is one detail that cannot be overlooked. In the dialogue, Critias insists that this story, though strange, is certainly true. He says this in front of Socrates, Timaeus, and Hermocrates, all real people, known in Athenian history. If this story is completely fictional, why does Plato attach it to specific historical figures and a detailed oral tradition? Furthermore, why would Plato choose Solon, one of the most revered figures in Athenian history, to carry this story? Solon was not just a lawgiver, he was also one of the 7 sages of ancient Greece. Men considered to possess the highest wisdom and virtue. Attaching the story to Solon was a way to add credibility to it. But at the same time, we are faced with an uncomfortable truth. Even Plato's most trusted student, Aristotle, apparently did not believe in Atlantis. Strabo, the Greek geographer who lived in the 1st century BC, famously quoted Aristotle as saying, "He who created it was also its destroyer." This quote implies that Plato invented and sunk Atlantis himself in his own imagination. But did Aristotle really say that? Thorwald C. Frank, a modern scholar, devoted an entire book to exploring this question and found that the quote may have been misinterpreted over the centuries. In fact, we have no direct evidence that Aristotle denied Atlantis, only indirect references by later authors. And now we come to one of the greatest mysteries of Atlantis, not about the lost city itself, but about the story told about it. Plato's dialogue, Critias, was never finished. It ends abruptly, in the middle of a sentence. Zeus, king of the gods, has just summoned all the gods to his palace at the center of the universe, a place with a view of all creation. The gods are seated, Zeus opens his mouth to speak. And the story ends. Exactly there. We never learn what Zeus said. We never learn what punishment the gods inflicted on Atlantis. We never see the full details of the war between Athens and Atlantis. Why? This is a question that has been debated for over 2.300 years. There are 3 main theories. Hypothesis 1. Plato completed the book, but the final part was lost to time. Scholar H.S. Bellamy points out something strange. No classical writer commented on the unfinished nature of Critias until Plutarch in the early 2nd century AD, nearly 500 years after Plato wrote. This suggests that the original manuscript may have been complete, but the final pages were fragmented and lost in copying over the centuries. It is hard to believe that a writer as talented as Plato could not complete a sentence. The second theory. Plato intended to finish it but couldn't, perhaps because of old age, illness, or death before he could finish. But there's a problem with this theory. Plato later wrote the Laws, a much larger and more complex dialogue. If he had time to write the Laws, why didn't he finish the Critias? The third, and perhaps most compelling, hypothesis is that Plato intentionally left the book unfinished. It may sound strange, but there is considerable evidence for this view. The ancient philosopher Proclus believed this, and a growing number of modern scholars agree. Recall that in the Timaeus, as Critias summarizes the story, we learn that Solon himself never finished his epic poem about Atlantis. This may have been a subtle foreshadowing from Plato. The story of Atlantis seems to be cursed. It was never told in its entirety. Solon did not finish it. Plato did not finish it. And the promised third dialogue, Hermocrates, was never even written. Is there a deep philosophical reason for this? Some scholars argue that the story ends exactly where it should end. According to scholar J.V. Kennedy's theory of the stichometric structure of Plato's dialogues, Critias actually ends exactly at the midpoint, where Zeus is about to pronounce judgment. This is the typical structure of a complete Platonic dialogue. Furthermore, think about this. Plato is writing about history, but Plato is also commenting on his contemporary historians, particularly Herodotus and Thucydides. Both of these men were famous for writing long speeches to historical figures. Speeches whose actual content they could not possibly know. Thucydides even admitted that he had composed these speeches himself. And this is where Plato ends, just before Zeus speaks. By refusing to write down Zeus's speech, Plato is making a statement about the veracity of historical records. He is saying, I will not invent what I cannot know. Now we come to one of the most controversial aspects of the Atlantis story, the matter of time. The Egyptian priest says that the story takes place 9.000 years before the time of Solon, that is, about 9.600 BC, or 11.600 years from today. This number creates huge problems. According to all the archaeological evidence we have, no civilization in 9.600 BC could have built the cities and empires Plato described. This was the early Neolithic period, the period when humans were just beginning to transition from hunter-gatherers to farmers. There was no writing, no metal, no wheel, certainly no golden palaces and warships. But here's where things get interesting. There's a possibility that many scholars have suggested. It's a translation error. The Egyptians used a different number system than the Greeks. It's possible the Egyptian priest said 900 years. But Solon, or a later translator, misread it as 9.000 years. If we adjust this figure, things suddenly make a lot more sense. 900 years before Solon would put us back to around 1500 BC, the Late Bronze Age. To be precise, the time of great civilizations like the Minoans, Mycenaeans, New Kingdom Egyptians, and the Hittite Empire. And here's the kicker, around 1600 to 1500 BC. One of the most devastating natural disasters in human history occurred, the eruption of the Thera volcano, modern-day Santorini. This eruption was many times more powerful than the Krakatoa eruption of 1883. It created a tsunami tens of meters high that devastated the entire Mediterranean. It may have contributed to the collapse of the Minoan civilization, one of the most advanced civilizations of the Bronze Age. So was Plato, or the Egyptian priests, telling of a real historical event, but with the timing confused and exaggerated over centuries of oral tradition? But there is one aspect of the Atlantis story that makes many people stop and think. The incredible level of detail Plato provides in Critias. This is no vague story about a mythical island. Plato gives specific numbers, precise measurements, and detailed architectural descriptions. He tells of the diameters of the water and land circles surrounding the central city. He describes the length and width of the giant canal that encircled the plain. He lists the metals used in construction: gold, silver, copper, and a mysterious metal called orichalcum, painted bronze, that was second only to gold in value. He even tells us the exact number of horses and chariots in the Atlantean army. He describes the political structure, 10 kings reigning together, each ruling a part of the empire, all descendants of Poseidon and a mortal woman named Plato. This is a level of detail one wouldn't normally concoct for a simple philosophical allegory. When Plato wanted to create a philosophical example, he usually kept it abstract, like the famous cave in The Republic. But with Atlantis, he got extremely specific. Moreover, some of Plato's details seem so strange as to be unbelievable, and he himself admits this. For example, when describing the giant canal that encircled the plain of Atlantis, Plato has Critias say, "Its depth and breadth and length make it doubtful that such an artificial construction could have been made." Along with all the others. However, we must report what we have heard. This is remarkable. Plato is admitting that these numbers sound incredible, but he tells them anyway. Claiming that this is what has been passed down. If he is making things up, why admit that his story doesn't sound plausible? And now we come to one of the biggest twists in the understanding of the Atlantis story, a twist that much of popular culture has missed. In most modern accounts of Atlantis, it is portrayed as a perfect utopia destroyed by the gods out of arrogance. But that is not quite what Plato wrote. Atlantis was originally a great society. The descendants of Poseidon, for many generations, ruled justly and wisely. They had excellent laws, they respected the gods, and they lived simply despite their immense wealth. Plato wrote, "By such wisdom, and by their divine nature, they acquired all the riches we have described." But over time, the divine blood in their veins becomes diluted. Their mortal nature begins to take over. And when that happens, things begin to change. Plato writes, "When the divine part of them begins to fade, they can no longer bear their good fortune, and begin to behave unworthily. To those who have eyes to see, they are clearly depraved, but to those who do not have eyes to see true happiness, they still appear glorious and blessed, at the very moment when they are full of greed and unjust power." This is the crux of Plato's story. Atlantis is not a story of a perfect society destroyed. It is a story of moral decay, of how a great society can destroy itself from within while still believing itself to be at the height of its glory. And ancient Athens? According to Plato, they were the complete opposite. They lived simply, focused on virtue and law rather than wealth. They were the truly moral civilization, and that's why they were able to defeat a much more powerful empire. But here is the final and most painful twist. Both are destroyed. The winners and the losers, the just and the unjust, all sink into the earth and sea in a single day and night. Now we can begin to understand why Plato told this story. He was not simply recording ancient history or creating a thrilling adventure story. He was sending a message to the Athens of his time, 4th century BC Athens. Remember the historical context. Plato lived through one of Athens' darkest times. He saw his city triumphantly in the Persian Wars, becoming the leading empire in Greece, and then destroying itself in the disastrous Peloponnesian War with Sparta. He saw Athenian democracy degenerate into factional politics. He saw his teacher, Socrates, executed on baseless charges. And most importantly, he saw Athens undertake the disastrous expedition to Sicily in 415 BC, an ambitious attempt to conquer Sicily that ended in utter failure, with thousands of Athenians dead and enslaved. Does the story of Atlantis attacking and attempting to enslave the Mediterranean resonate familiarly? For Plato's Athenian audience, it certainly did. They became the very thing they had fought against. They became Atlantis. Plato is warning. Look, once our Athens was great because we placed virtue above power, law above ambition. But now, like Atlantis, we have let greed and pride ruin us. And if we do not change, our fate will be no different from Atlantis. This is why the story of Atlantis was never really about finding a sunken island. It was always about looking in the mirror and realizing what we can become if we are not careful. And now, as we close chapter 1, consider this. Plato wrote Critias some 2.385 years ago. During that time, the story of Atlantis has haunted the human imagination like no other myth. Thousands of books have been written, hundreds of expeditions have been organized, countless theories have been proposed. But perhaps we've been looking in the wrong place. Perhaps Atlantis isn't at the bottom of the ocean or hidden in the Amazon jungle. Perhaps it's a story about ourselves, about the rise and fall of civilizations, about the dangers of unchecked ambition, about the tragic consequences when we lose our moral compass. But that doesn't mean there isn't a kernel of historical truth to the story. In Chapter 2, we'll explore the big question: where was Atlantis? We'll examine the archaeological evidence, geological discoveries, and the startling parallels between Plato's story and real-life disasters. We'll travel from the Aegean Sea to the Atlantic Ocean, from Egypt to Gibraltar, searching for clues to this mystery. But before we do that, let's pause and reflect on what we've learned. We've heard the story from its original source. We've seen it passed down through the generations, from the Egyptian priest to Solon, from Solon to Plato, and from Plato to us today. We've seen amazing details, confusing contradictions, and profound philosophical lessons. We've seen how a story can be history, allegory, and warning all at once. And most importantly, we have seen that whether Atlantis really existed or not, its message is still relevant today. In our world, with climate change threatening coastal cities, with rising inequality, with great powers competing for power, the story of a great civilization destroying itself has never been more urgent. Plato ends his story with Zeus about to pronounce judgment. He never shows us the final punishment. Perhaps that is because the punishment is still ongoing. Perhaps each civilization must decide its own fate. And as you lie there in the dark, pondering this story, ask yourself, where are we in the cycle? Are we righteous Athens, or are we becoming arrogant Atlantis? And more importantly, is it too late to change? Your sleep will not only bring dreams of cities sinking into the sea. It will bring questions about our own future. We've heard the story from Plato. We've seen the amazing details, the confusing contradictions, and the profound philosophical lessons. But now the biggest question remains. The biggest of all. Where is Atlantis? Since the 19th century, hundreds of archaeologists, geologists, explorers and mystery enthusiasts have dedicated their lives to finding answers. They have searched everywhere, from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, from the Caribbean to Antarctica, even under the Sahara Desert. And the strange thing is, some of their findings are truly astonishing. Not all of them are fabrications or delusions. There are places that really make even the most serious scientists stop and think, could it be? Let's begin our journey at what is perhaps the most widely accepted candidate for Atlantis, a beautiful island in the Aegean Sea where, some 3.600 years ago, one of the most horrific natural disasters in human history occurred. If you've ever seen an image of Santorini, white houses with blue domes perched on steep cliffs overlooking the deep blue sea, you're looking at evidence of a geological nightmare. Santorini today is not actually an island, but rather fragments of an island. What we see is the outer rim of a giant caldera, a volcanic sinkhole, created by a catastrophic eruption around 1600 BC. Before the eruption, this was a large round island, which the ancient Greeks called Thera, and on this island, an advanced civilization was flourishing, the Minoan civilization. The Minoans are one of the great mysteries of Mediterranean archaeology. They appeared on Crete and surrounding islands around 3000 BC. And over nearly 2 millennia, they built a brilliant civilization. They were the first Europeans to use writing, a system called Linear A which has yet to be deciphered. They built huge palaces with sophisticated drainage systems, including toilets and running water. They were excellent craftsmen, creating exquisite works of art. And most importantly, they were skilled seafarers. Their maritime empire stretched across the Mediterranean. And then, around 1600 BC, the volcano Thera awoke. Try to imagine the scale of this disaster. Geologists estimate that the Thera eruption had a volcanic explosivity index, VEI, of 6 or 7, one of the largest eruptions in recorded human history. For comparison, the 1883 Krakatoa eruption, one of the most famous natural disasters of modern times, killing more than 36,000 people, had a VEI of only 6. The 1815 Tambora eruption, the largest eruption in recorded history, which created the year without a summer worldwide, had a VEI of 7. The Thera eruption was on a par with these events. Perhaps even more powerful, it ejected an estimated 28 to 41 cubic kilometers, 18 to 140 cubic miles, of material, many times more than Krakatoa. The plume of ash and gas shot 36 kilometers into the atmosphere. Volcanic lightning, huge bolts of lightning created by the electrical charge in the ash cloud, would have lit up the sky in an apocalyptic nightmare. But the worst part wasn't the main eruption, it was what came after. When the central part of the island collapsed into the sea, it created huge tsunami waves tens of meters high, which swept across the Aegean Sea at terrifying speed. Geological studies show that these waves devastated the northern coast of Crete, just 110 kilometers from Thera, with an estimated height of between 9 and 15 meters. At the site of Polykastro in eastern Crete, archaeologists found a chaotic layer of sediment, soil, building materials, broken pottery, even cattle bones, all mixed together and petrified. Carbon dating of a cow bone fragment in this layer yielded a date of about 1600 BC, the exact time of the eruption. And within this sediment, they found pumice from Thera, incontrovertible evidence that the volcanic tsunami had washed these fragments ashore on Crete. But here's the first twist in the Santorini story, despite the horrific eruption. Not a single body has been found on Santorini. In 1967, Greek archaeologist Spyridon Marinatos began excavating at Akrotiri, a Minoan city south of Santorini. What he found stunned the archaeological world. Beneath meters of ash and pumice, Akrotiri has been almost perfectly preserved, like Italy's Pompeii, but 1.500 years older. The entire city is still there, 3-story buildings with stunning wall paintings, exquisite ceramics, furniture, even the intricate plumbing system. The murals at Akrotiri offer a valuable glimpse into Minoan life. There are lush natural scenes, gazelles running through fields, farmers harvesting saffron. There are maritime scenes, large, oar-rigged ships sailing past coastal cities. There are also religious scenes, ceremonies and rituals. But there were no corpses, no skeletons, no people dying suddenly in the midst of everyday life like in Pompeii. Floyd W. McCoy, professor of geology and oceanography at the University of Hawaii, noted that this meant the local population had advance warning of the impending eruption and evacuated the island before it was destroyed. How did they know? There were probably warning earthquakes, increasing tremors that signaled that the volcano was waking up. There might have been smoke and gas escaping from the fissures. The Minoans had lived on volcanic islands for generations, they would have known the signs. So they went, taking what they could, leaving everything else behind, and when the volcano erupted, Akrotiri was buried, preserved under ash for us to discover 3.600 years later. And now we come to the fun part. Is Santorini Atlantis? Spyridon Marinatos, the discoverer of Akrotiri, believed so. He suggested that the Minoan eruption mirrored Plato's story of Atlantis. And when you consider the similarities, it's hard to dismiss the idea entirely. Similarity number 1. An advanced civilization on a volcanic island. The Minoan civilization was the first European civilization. They had writing, complex palaces, sophisticated art, and a powerful maritime empire. This matches Plato's description of Atlantis as a great and marvelous civilization. Similarity number 2. Destroyed by a sudden natural disaster. Plato wrote that Atlantis was hit by violent earthquakes and floods, and, in a day and a night, it disappeared. The Thera eruption was exactly that type of disaster, earthquake, tsunami, and the collapse of the island. Third similarity, widespread impact. Plato said that the disaster destroyed not only Atlantis but also ancient Athens. Similarly, the Thera eruption not only destroyed Santorini but also caused tsunamis and ash to fall across the entire eastern Mediterranean, affecting many civilizations. Fourth similarity, island structure. Before the eruption, Thera was a circular island with a lagoon in the center, not exactly like Plato's concentric circles, but with some similarities in basic structure. Similarity number 5. Lost in history. After the Minoan civilization collapsed, it gradually faded from historical memory. By Plato's time, more than 1.000 years later, the Greeks had only vague myths about the earlier, heroic age. Sounds appealing, right? A real civilization, a real disaster, all fitting into Plato's story. Problem solved, right? Not really, because when you look closer, there are serious problems with the Santorini theory. The first problem is geography. Plato explicitly states that Atlantis is located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, that is, beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, out into the Atlantic Ocean. Santorini is located deep in the Mediterranean, within the Strait of Gibraltar, not outside. This is not a small detail that we can ignore. Plato emphasizes this location many times. The second problem, time. This is the biggest problem. Plato said that Atlantis existed 9.000 years before Solon, that is, about 9.600 BC. The Thera eruption happened around 1600 BC. That's a difference of 8.000 years. Even if we assume that there was a translation error and the number is actually 900 years instead of 9.000, we still don't match 900 years before Solon would be about 1500 BC. Still incorrect. The third problem is size. Plato describes Atlantis as a huge empire that controlled many other islands, together with parts of the continent, and had subdued Libya as far as Egypt, and Europe as far as Tyrrhenia. Although the Minoans were skilled traders and seafarers, we have no evidence that they ever controlled such a vast empire. Fourth problem, structure. Plato's detailed description of concentric circles alternating between land and water doesn't really match Santorini. Even before the eruption, Akrotiri was a typical Minoan city, not a citadel with a distinctive circular structure. Problem 5. No war. Plato says that Atlantis was destroyed after a war with Athens. There is no evidence of a military conflict between the Minoans and mainland Greeks at the time of the eruption. So if Santorini isn't Atlantis, why does it matter? Here's the twist. Santorini may not be Atlantis, but it shows us something deeper, that Plato may have been based on real events. Consider this. In Plato's time, around 360 BC, the Thera eruption had occurred nearly 1.300 years earlier. That's as long a time as it would have been between today and Charlemagne's time or the Tang dynasty in China. Yet the memory of this disaster may have been passed down through legend and myth. The Egyptians, with their complex writing system, may have known about this eruption. Indeed, there is an Egyptian stele called the Tempest stele, from the reign of Ahmose I, circa 1550 to 1525 BC, that describes a terrible storm and natural disaster that some scholars believe may be related to the Thera eruption. So when the Egyptian priests told Solon about a legendary civilization destroyed by earthquake and flood, they may have been remembering, albeit vaguely and distorted by time, a real disaster that had occurred in the past. And Plato, receiving this story through Solon, may have added his own details, setting it in the Atlantic to suit his philosophical purposes, adjusting the time to make it more ancient, and adding elements of war with Athens to serve his moral lesson. In other words, Atlantis may not be a single place, but a composite, a story woven from many sources, including real-life memories of the Santorini disaster, combined with elements of fantasy and philosophy. Now we're going to jump from the Mediterranean to a place that seems much more unbelievable, the middle of the Sahara Desert. In Mauritania, in the Adrar Highlands, there is a geological structure so strange that it can only be seen in full from space. Astronauts on the International Space Station call it the Eye of the Sahara. Its scientific name is the Richat structure. Seen from above, it resembles a giant eye looking up from the desert, a series of concentric circles, about 40 to 50 kilometers in diameter. The center is a high dome about 20 kilometers wide, surrounded by alternating circles of different types of rock. When it was first photographed by Gemini astronauts in 1965, scientists thought it was a meteorite crater, but closer examination revealed no signs of a meteorite impact, no shocked quartz, no extraterrestrial materials. Today, the scientific consensus is that the Richat structure is an ancient volcanic dome, formed about 100 million years ago when molten magma from below pushed up layers of sedimentary rock, forming a dome. Millions of years of erosion by wind and water then created the concentric rings we see today. as alternating layers of hard and soft rock eroded at different rates. But in 2018, a YouTube video from the channel, Bright Insight, took the internet by storm, claiming that the rechat structure was Atlantis. And surprisingly, the theory attracted millions of viewers and created a global movement. Why is this theory so appealing? Because, admittedly, there are some striking coincidences. Coincidence number 1. Structure. The rechat structure has concentric circles, exactly as Plato described Atlantis. Plato said that Atlantis' central city consisted of alternating circles of land and water, in a specific ratio. Some proponents of the rechat theory argue that the circles of the rechat structure match this ratio, or at least approximate it. Second coincidence. Size. The diameter of the Atlantis citadel, according to Plato, was about 127 stadia, about 23 kilometers. The inner circle of the rechat structure is about 20 to 23 kilometers in diameter, depending on how you measure. This is a surprising match. Third coincidence. Geography. Plato said that Atlantis was located on a plain surrounded by mountains. The rechat structure is located in a mountainous region to the north. It is also much closer to the Atlantic Ocean than Santorini, although not beyond the Pillars of Hercules, but at least on the same exact ocean shore. Fourth coincidence. Resources. Plato described Atlantis as rich in precious metals, copper and other metals. The area around the rechat structure contained copper, gold, and other minerals. Mauritania today exports copper and gold. Coincidence number 5. Water traces. Satellite imagery shows what appear to be ancient riverbeds leading to and from the rechat structure. Some proponents claim this is evidence that the area was once surrounded by water. Coincidence number 6. The Green Sahara. This is perhaps the most interesting. Recent scientific studies have confirmed that the Sahara was not always a desert. During what is known as the African humid period, from about 11,000 to 5,000 years ago, the region was a lush grassland with lakes, rivers, and abundant wildlife. The Smithsonian Institution estimates that the region was quite lush tropical before 11,000 years ago. If Atlantis existed around 11,600 years ago, like the 9,600 BC time Plato mentions, that would put it right at the end of the Ice Age, when the Sahara was transitioning from desert to verdant. Sounds fascinating, right? A perfect circular structure in the exact spot where Atlantis is said to be. In the exact right size. In a once verdant area. But the scientific reality is different. The rechat structure is not man-made. It is a natural geological structure that formed millions of years before humans even existed. Geologists have studied it in detail and the conclusion is clear. This is an eroded geologic dome, not the ruins of an ancient city. Furthermore, there is no archaeological evidence of an advanced civilization here. There are no walls, no foundations, no metal tools, no writing. Some proponents of rechat's theory say the evidence has been eroded or buried, but that is exactly the kind of argument that science cannot accept. You cannot assert the existence of something by saying that all the evidence has disappeared. And finally, there is the issue of seawater. Plato makes it clear that Atlantis was a sunken island. The rechat structure is located in the desert, hundreds of miles from the sea. Even during the African humid period, the area was not an oceanic island, it was an inland grassland. So, while the rechat structure is a beautiful and fascinating geological phenomenon, it is not Atlantis. But the fact that millions of people believe it could be Atlantis tells us something about the power of this story, and about our desire to find it. Now we come to a site that is perhaps the most serious scientific candidate for Atlantis. A site in the very place Plato said it was, near the Pillars of Hercules. In 2001, French geologist Jacques Collina-Girard published a groundbreaking study in the prestigious scientific journal Comptes Rendus de l'Académie des Sciences. He proposed that there was an actual island in the Strait of Gibraltar, one that sank into the sea about 11,000 years ago. The island is called Spartel Bank, or sometimes Spartel Paleo Island. Today, it is a seamount. Its highest point is 56 meters below the surface. But during the last ice age, when sea levels were 130 to 135 meters lower than they are today, Spartel Bank was a veritable island. High-resolution bathymetric data show that at its lowest sea level, around 20,000 years ago, Spartel was an island about 6.5 kilometers long and 4 kilometers wide. It was strategically located, right in the narrowest strait between Europe and Africa, at the entrance to the Mediterranean. And here's the amazing thing. The time of its sinking matches exactly the time Plato mentioned. Kalina Gerard calculates that the island began sinking around 11.600 years ago, exactly 9.600 years before Solon, the date Plato recorded. But Spartel did not simply sink gradually due to rising sea levels. There is evidence of a sudden and violent catastrophe. In 2005, marine geophysicist Marc-André Gutcher published a follow-up study in the journal Geology. He showed that the Gulf of Cadiz, right next to the Strait of Gibraltar, experiences large earthquakes, magnitude 8 to 9, and tsunamis with a return period of 1.500 to 2.000 years. We know this not just from theory. In 1755, a massive earthquake of magnitude 8.5 to 9 devastated Lisbon, creating a 10-meter-high tsunami. It was one of the worst natural disasters in modern European history, killing tens of thousands of people. And here's the big find. Gutcher found an incredibly thick layer of turbidite in marine sediments, dated to about 12.000 years ago. Turbidites like this are created by catastrophic events, large earthquakes or giant submarine landslides that stir up seafloor sediments. So we have geological evidence that a major catastrophe occurred in this region at exactly the time that Kalina Gerard says Spartel sank. It's not a coincidence. Picture the scene. A massive earthquake rocks the entire region. Aftershocks continue for hours or days. And then, a tsunami, some tens of meters high, rushes across the narrow strait, sweeping away everything in its path. For any community living on Spartel, this would have been a world-ending disaster. And through a combination of earthquakes, tsunamis, and the rise in sea levels after the Ice Age, the island disappeared beneath the waves, in a day and a night. As Plato wrote. But do people actually live on Spartel? Could a community develop there? Gutcher and colleagues studied the detailed morphology of Spartel using high-resolution bathymetric data. They found large flat areas, possibly ancient terraces, at depths of 120 meters below the current surface. These terraces may have recorded a long period of stable sea levels, when humans may have settled. Furthermore, Spartel's location would have been ideal for an ancient hunter-gatherer or fishing community. It was located right at the crossroads between Europe and Africa, in one of the world's most important straits. The surrounding waters would have been rich in fish and shellfish, and with a mild Mediterranean climate, living conditions would have been quite favorable. Indirect evidence supports this as well. Kalina Gerard proposes that the island's disappearance was recorded in Egyptian prehistoric tradition for 5.000 years until it was written down by the first Egyptian scribes around 4000–3000 BC. This may seem far-fetched, but anthropology has shown that oral tradition can preserve memories of important events over millennia. For example, Aboriginal Australians have oral stories about a time when sea levels were lower, when the islands that are now connected to the mainland, and archaeologists have confirmed that these stories accurately reflect the geography of more than 10.000 years ago. So is Spartel Atlantis? It fits many of Plato's details: its proximity to the Pillars of Hercules, the time of the sinking, the type of disaster, earthquake and flood, and even the ability of oral tradition to preserve memory. But there is one big problem: scale. Spartel was a small island, only about 6.5 kilometers long. Plato described a huge empire with a central city dozens of kilometers wide, surrounded by circles of water and land, with palaces, temples, ports, and a mighty army. Gutcher acknowledges this in his research. After using mapping software to survey the area, he concluded that Atlantis did not exist on the small island of Spartel. There was no sign of a great ancient city built of stone. However, evidence discovered on land nearby suggests that during the Stone Age, when sea levels were much lower, people lived here. So, Spartel may not have been the Atlantis Plato described, but it may have had a kernel of truth. There may have been a small community living there, and when the island sank in a sudden catastrophe, the story was passed down through the generations, exaggerated and dramatized over time, until it became the myth of the great empire we read about in Plato. And now we come to the biggest twist of Chapter 2, one that many Atlantis hunters don't want to hear. Maybe Atlantis wasn't a single, specific place. Maybe it was a composite, a story woven from many different sources. Think about what we've seen. Santorini shows us an advanced civilization destroyed by volcanic disaster and tsunami. Spartel shows us an island that actually sank at the exact time Plato mentions. The rechat structure, though not man-made, shows us how nature can create amazing shapes. Each of these locations has its part of the story, but no single location fits all of Plato's details perfectly. And here's the key point. Plato probably wasn't describing a specific place. He probably was combining multiple stories, memories of Santorini from Greek tradition, stories of Spartel from Egyptian priests, perhaps memories of other disasters we don't know about. Then he added his own details, geometrically perfect concentric circles, precise troop numbers, detailed descriptions of palaces. These details were too perfect, too symmetrical, too idealistic. They felt like philosophical architecture, not historical reporting. Plato was a philosopher, not a historian. His purpose was not to write an accurate account of a real place. His purpose was to teach a lesson about the dangers of unchecked ambition, about the cycle of rise and fall of civilizations, about the importance of moral virtue. But if Atlantis isn't a specific place, why do we keep looking? Because this story touches something deep in the human soul. It speaks to our yearning for a golden past, a time when things were better, when people lived in harmony, when technology and intelligence were more advanced. It also speaks to our fears, the fear that all we have built could disappear in an instant. In our time, when climate change threatens coastal cities, when geopolitical tensions rise, when we see modern civilizations facing great challenges, the story of Atlantis is more urgent than ever. And perhaps the search for Atlantis isn't really about finding a lost city. It's about the search for understanding, about our past, about the nature of civilization, about what causes societies to rise and fall. Every expedition to find Atlantis, whether Santorini or Sparta or elsewhere, has taught us something valuable about history, geology, archaeology, and humanity itself. We've discovered real lost civilizations, like the Minoans. We've learned about real disasters, like the Thera eruption. We've mapped the ocean floor and discovered amazing geological formations. So, is the search in vain? Not at all, because in the search for the mythical Atlantis, we have found many real wonders. Before we end this chapter, there's one important thing to say. Every location we've explored, Santorini, Spartel, and countless others, all share a common theme. They are all places where nature has demonstrated its absolute power over human civilization. They are reminders that no matter how advanced we are, no matter how powerful we are still vulnerable to geological and climatic forces. Volcanoes erupt, earthquakes occur, sea levels rise, tsunamis wash over shores, and in those moments, all our wealth, all our power, all our technology becomes meaningless. Plato understood this. That's why he ends his story with both Atlantis and ancient Athens destroyed. The winners and the losers both sink. The lesson isn't, don't be evil like Atlantis. The lesson is, remember that we are all fragile. And in the 21st century, as we face our own global challenges, climate change, rising sea levels, increasingly frequent natural disasters, perhaps the lessons of Atlantis are more important than ever. Coastal cities around the world, from Miami to Venice, Bangkok to Amsterdam, are facing the same threat that Atlantis and Spartel faced, rising waters. Will we learn from the past? Or will we become the next Atlantis, a cautionary tale for future civilizations? And now, as the night grows deeper, as my voice grows softer, let us end our journey. We have traveled from Plato's library in Athens to the bottom of the Aegean Sea. We have flown over the Sahara and dived to the sunken islands off Gibraltar. We have heard stories from Egyptian priests, from Solon, from Plato, and from countless scientists, archaeologists, and dreamers over the centuries. And after all this, the question remains: did Atlantis really exist? Maybe the answer isn't yes or no. Maybe the answer is both and neither. Atlantis is real because Santorini is real, a real advanced civilization destroyed by volcanoes and tsunamis. Atlantis is real because Spartel is real, a real island that sank into the sea in a catastrophic earthquake. Atlantis is real because its lesson is real, that all civilizations, no matter how powerful, are vulnerable to forces they cannot control. But Atlantis is also a myth, a story created by Plato to teach us about virtue, about hubris, about the cycle of rise and fall of societies. It is a mirror into which we look and see ourselves, our desires, our fears, our mistakes. Psychologist Carl Jung perhaps said it best: Atlantis is an archetype, a symbol born from the collective subconscious. It is not a place out there waiting to be found. It is within us, a reminder of the heights we can reach, and how easily we can fall. That's why this story has endured for over 2.300 years. That's why it's been told in every culture, every time, every language, because it speaks to something deep and universal about the human experience. We fear losing what we have built. We yearn for a lost golden age. We hope that somewhere, beneath the waves or in the pages of ancient books, there is a forgotten knowledge waiting to be rediscovered. And perhaps that is the best thing about the Atlantis story. It makes us search, it makes us explore, it makes us question, and in the search for the mythical Atlantis, we find many real wonders about our world and about ourselves. So, as you lie there in the dark, pondering this story, don't ask, "Where is Atlantis?" Instead, ask, "What does Atlantis mean?" It means we must cherish what we have, because it may disappear faster than we think. It means we must learn from the past, because history repeats itself, not exactly, but closely enough to recognize patterns. It means we must balance ambition and humility, power and responsibility, progress and sustainability. In our world today, with rising sea levels, sinking coastal cities, and changing climates, Atlantis is no longer just an ancient tale. It is a warning, a reminder, a call to action. We can be the next generation of Atlantis, or we can be the generation that learns from Atlantis. The choice, as always, is ours. And now, sleep come to you. Dream of cities beneath the waves, of lost civilizations, of mysteries unsolved. But when you wake in the morning, remember, the greatest story of all is not what was lost, but what we do with what remains. Atlantis may have sunk, but its lessons still float above the surface, waiting for us to learn. Sleep well, and when you dream, dream not just of Atlantis, but of a future where we will not repeat the mistakes of the past. This is the Hidden Cipher. Thank you for joining us on our journey to solve the mystery of the lost city of Atlantis. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next amazing mysteries we will uncover. Leave a comment below. Did you think Atlantis really existed? Where do you think it was located? And more importantly, what lessons from Atlantis can we apply to today's world? Until next time, stay curious, keep exploring, and always remember that the greatest mysteries often teach us the most about ourselves. Good night and sweet dreams. The Hidden Cipher, where mysteries are solved, and sleep is found.